I stood up my boyfriend for a friend of mine. And now he won't forgive me for anything, and I'm very lonely. My name is Emily. I'm 28 years old, and today I find myself writing these words to try to unburden the weight of my mistakes. I never thought I could sink so low because of my own decisions, but here I am, facing a reality that I myself built. 5 years ago I met Raul, who at that time I thought was the love of my life. Raul was different from anyone I had ever met. He was patient, attentive, with a kindness that could brighten any gray day. I fell in love with him little by little, almost without realizing it, and before I knew it, we were together, building a relationship that I believed was unbreakable. Raul had that special way of making me feel loved. He always found ways to surprise me, to make me laugh, to remind me that no matter what happened, he would be there for me. He was, in every sense, a reliable and noble man, someone who didn't deserve what I did to him. Our relationship progressed naturally. We went out to dinner, watched movies, and when our responsibilities allowed, we planned small trips that helped us escape the routine. Raul was the kind of person who didn't need grand gestures to show his love. In the small details, like making my coffee in the morning or reminding me to take my umbrella on a rainy day, all that he felt for me was reflected. I, on the other hand, was always more impulsive and sometimes immature. Although I loved Raul, there was a part of me that always wanted more. Not because he wasn't enough, but because I didn't know how to be at peace with myself. That need for something more became a shadow that began to creep in between us without either of us noticing. At first, everything began to change when Leo reappeared in my life. Leo and I were classmates in college, and during those years we developed an intense and close friendship. He was always the extroverted, charismatic, and adventurous boy, completely different from Raul. Although nothing ever happened between us in college, there was always a connection that at the time I ignored because I knew it wouldn't lead to anything good. After years without hearing from him, Leo wrote to me one day on social media. The excitement of reconnecting with an old friend was inevitable. We started talking through messages, remembering anecdotes and catching up on our lives. At first, everything seemed innocent, but little by little the conversation started to become more personal. Leo had a way of making me feel special, something that at the time I didn't identify as dangerous. His attention, his way of flattering me, even his jokes with double meanings, began to occupy a space in my mind that should have been exclusively for Raul. The more I talked to Leo, the more I found myself comparing him to Raul, not because Raul was doing anything wrong, but because Leo offered me a feeling of excitement that my relationship wasn't giving me. At that time it was an unfair comparison, I know, because Raul offered me stability, love, and commitment, while Leo only offered me words and fleeting moments. However, that momentary excitement began to sow doubts in me. I began to question whether I was really ready for a serious commitment with Raul, if maybe I was letting something better pass me by. These doubts, of course, were fueled by my conversations with Leo, which became increasingly frequent and intimate. Raul began to notice that something wasn't right. He wasn't the jealous type, but his intuition told him something had changed. He asked me if everything was okay, if there was anything I wanted to talk about, and although instinct told me that I should open up to him, I didn't. I preferred to keep my doubts and my mistakes to myself, hoping that everything would resolve itself. One day while checking my phone, Raul saw a message from Leo that said, "Are you up for seeing each other tomorrow? I promise you won't regret it." Although I tried to downplay it by saying that he was just a friend, I saw in Raul's eyes the first spark of distrust. "Why haven't you told me about him before?" he asked calmly, but also with a sadness that broke my heart. I explained that he was an old friend from college, someone who had reappeared in my life casually. Although he accepted my explanation, I knew that something inside him had already changed. That night, while he slept, I stayed awake thinking about what I was doing. I knew I was crossing a dangerous line, but instead of stopping, I kept going. The conversations with Leo became an escape, a way to feel something that in my mind I had lost in my relationship. The distance between Raul and me began subtly, almost imperceptibly. I was still the smiling girl he loved, but something inside me had changed. Every time Leo sent me a message or complimented me, I felt a tingle in my stomach, something I mistook for excitement. Despite Raul showing me every day how much he loved me, I found myself questioning myself. "You seem a little distant." He smiled at me as if nothing was wrong. "Yeah, everything's fine. I'm just a little tired." He didn't insist, but his eyes conveyed something more. It was as if he knew something was wrong even though he couldn't put a name to it. Later that night, while he slept beside me, I was still awake checking my messages. Leo had sent a simple, "How are you?" And without thinking I replied. What started as a light chat quickly escalated into something more personal. We talked about things I didn't share with Raul. My insecurities, my frustrations, even my most selfish dreams. Leo had a disturbing ability to make me feel heard, but it wasn't because he really cared. Now I understand that he simply knew how to say what I needed to hear at that moment. I found myself justifying those conversations, telling myself that it was harmless, that it was just a friendship. But deep down I knew I was playing with fire. Gradually my attention was divided. Raul was still my partner, but my mind was beginning to be elsewhere. When we went out together, I found it difficult to concentrate on his words. Even in the most intimate moments, I felt a disconnect that I had never experienced before. That's when something happened that ended up marking a rift. One afternoon while Raul was at work, Leo called me and said, "Emily, why don't we meet? I just want to talk to you face to face." My heart beat faster than I expected. I knew accepting that invitation was risky, but the temptation was stronger than my logic. That was the first time I met Leo alone in years. We saw each other at a cafe, and although our conversation started lightly, it became increasingly personal. Leo made comments that crossed a line, jokes with double meanings that shouldn't have made me feel good, but they did. That afternoon, as I was returning home, guilt began to weigh on my chest. Why was I putting my relationship with Raul at risk for attention I knew was superficial? But instead of stopping, I continued. The days following our constant discussions with Raul were full of small gestures on his part. It was as if he was determined to show me how much he cared about our relationship and how much he wanted it to work. One Wednesday afternoon, after arriving exhausted from work, he had prepared dinner with lit candles and soft background music. The scene was so perfect that for a moment I thought I had been transported back to the early days of our relationship. Raul had that way about him that always managed to disarm me. Attentive, thoughtful, and deeply affectionate. "Emily, I want you to know that I've been thinking about us, about everything we've been through together, and I want to propose something special." At that moment he took out a folder with a reservation for a weekend at a boutique hotel in the mountains, a place we had mentioned many times in our talks about dream trips. I want it to be a weekend just for us, without distractions, without worries. I want to remind you how much I love you and how good we can be together. His words, charged with sincerity and love, made me feel a mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to accept without hesitation, to leave behind my confused thoughts and focus on rebuilding what we had. But another part, the one that had been feeding my connection with Leo, couldn't ignore the shadow of my doubts. "Oh, Raul, that sounds incredible," I replied with a smile, even though inside I felt a discomfort I couldn't ignore. That night, as he slept peacefully beside me, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a message from Leo. "See you Friday. I have something I want to tell you in person." My heart skipped a beat. It was the same day Raul and I had planned to go to the hotel. I tried to ignore the message, but curiosity mixed with that strange feeling of attraction to Leo began to take hold of me. I spent the rest of the night debating. At one point, while he was in the kitchen preparing something to take, I picked up the phone and wrote a quick message to Leo. "I can't see you today, I'm sorry." But as soon as I sent it, my chest filled with a feeling of emptiness. Leo replied almost immediately, "I know you want to come, Emily. You don't have to explain yourself. Just tell me the time and I'll be there." My hands were shaking as I read his words. It was as if he knew exactly how to manipulate me, how to push those buttons that made me feel special and desired. The clock struck 4 p.m. and Raul was ready to leave. He looked at me with a warm smile, the one that always made me feel safe. "Ready?" I looked at him and nodded, but the words wouldn't come out of my mouth. My mind was still wandering, and in an impulse I can't justify even now, I pretended I had forgotten something in the apartment. "Give me 5 minutes, Raul. I have to look for something." I ran upstairs and without thinking too much I wrote to Leo. "I'm on my way." I left Raul waiting in the car while I made up an excuse to justify my absence. I told him that a friend had had an emergency, and that I needed to help her before I left. Trusting as always, he believed me and let me go. When I arrived at the place where Leo and I had agreed to meet, he greeted me with that carefree smile that always managed to disarm me. We sat down at a nearby cafe, and although at first I tried to keep the conversation light, Leo soon took things to a more personal level. Emily, I can't keep pretending that we're just friends. I know you feel the same way I do. His words, combined with the intimate atmosphere and the accumulated tension, led me to cross a line I should never have crossed. We kissed, and at that moment all the years I had shared with Raul seemed to vanish into the back of my mind. I spent more time than I should have with Leo that day, ignoring Raul's calls and messages. When I finally returned, guilt hit me like a giant wave. Raul was sitting on the sofa, worried and confused. I had ruined our weekend. What happened, Emily? Why did it take you so long? His genuine concern destroyed me, but instead of facing my actions, I lied again. It was more complicated than I expected, but everything's fine now. Raul didn't suspect anything at that moment, but I knew I was playing with fire, and that it wouldn't be long before everything collapsed. The days after my encounter with Leo were full of tension. As much as I tried to get back to normal with Raul, the weight of my guilt and the distance I had created myself were impossible to ignore. He looked at me with the same tenderness as always, but I couldn't hold his gaze without feeling like I was failing every second. One night, while Raul and I were having dinner, I noticed he was quieter than usual. He didn't ask me about my day or try to start a conversation, something so characteristic of him. Instead, he seemed to be studying me, as if trying to find the answers to questions he hadn't yet dared to ask. Emily, is everything okay? He finally asked, his voice quiet but full of uncertainty. I nodded quickly, trying to sound convincing. Yeah, of course. Why do you ask? I don't know. I feel like you're distant lately. You're not the same. Guilt hit me like a hammer. I tried to deflect the subject, but every word I said seemed more suspicious than the last. Raul was an intelligent person, and although he didn't say anything else, it was clear that something didn't add up. That night, while he was sleeping, I made the mistake of leaving my phone on the nightstand unlocked. Raul, who had been struggling with his suspicions, finally succumbed to the temptation to look for answers. He checked my messages, and with them he found everything he needed to know. The texts with Leo left no room for doubt. They were there. Our flirtatious conversations, the excuses I made up to see him, and even the photos from the day I left him waiting in the car. Every word and every image was a direct stab to Raul's heart. When I woke up the next day, I found him sitting on the edge of the bed with the phone in his hand and an expression of pain I will never forget. His eyes, normally warm and full of love, were dull, as if something inside him had been irreparably broken. What is this, Emily? He asked, his voice low and trembling, as if he couldn't believe what he had read. I froze. There was no way to deny it, not after he had seen everything. I tried to stammer a reply, but the words caught in my throat. You lied to me. You cheated on me with him while I was here believing in you, in us. The pain in his voice was palpable, and every word pierced me like a knife. I tried to explain myself, to tell him that it had been a mistake, that I didn't know what I was thinking, but he didn't want to hear excuses. I can't believe it, Emily. I gave you all my love, my time, my dreams, and you pay me like this. Raul, please let me explain. I didn't want to hurt you. I was confused. Confused? He interrupted, getting out of bed with the phone still in his hand. There's no confusion here, Emily. You chose to betray me. His words echoed in the room, filling it with an unbearable emptiness. I tried to get closer to him, to touch his arm, but he pulled away as if my mere presence disgusted him. Raul, please give me a chance. I can fix this. I can show you I still love you. Love me? If you loved me, you would never have done this. At that moment his decision was clear, even though I didn't want to accept it. I want you to leave, Emily. I can't stay with you after this. My world crumbled at that moment. I knew I had made a terrible mistake, but I never thought it would come to losing him this way. His tone left no room for doubt. There was no room for forgiveness or second chances. Raul gave me until the end of the day to collect my things and leave his apartment. Every time he saw me walking back and forth packing my belongings, his look was a mixture of pain, disappointment, and above all, determination. Emily, I don't want to hear anything more from you. I don't want your apologies, your promises, or your regrets. Just leave. Those words hurt more than I could bear. But I knew I had no right to ask him for anything else. I had brought it on myself, and now I was facing the consequences of my actions. When I finally finished packing, I stopped at the door hoping Raul would say something, anything that would give me a glimmer of hope. But he just stood there with his arms crossed and his eyes full of tears that he refused to let fall. "Goodbye, Raul," I whispered, but he didn't answer. I closed the door behind me, and at that moment I knew I had lost him forever. It's been months since Raul kicked me out of his life, and every day feels like I'm serving an endless sentence for my decisions. His memory is everywhere. In the small details of everyday life, in the places we used to frequent, even in moments of silence when loneliness becomes unbearable. I never imagined regret could be so heavy, so paralyzing. Sometimes I wake up with the urge to call him, to write him a message, to beg him to listen to me at least one more time. But when I pick up the phone, I just stare at the screen, remembering the last time I saw his face, that mixture of pain and disappointment in his eyes. It's a memory I'll never be able to erase. The emptiness I feel since losing him is immense. Raul was my support, my balance, the person who made me feel safe, even in my worst moments. Now without him, every day seems like an endless struggle. I've tried to occupy my time with other things. Work, exercise, going out with friends, but nothing fills the void left by his absence. I've tried to find comfort by talking to my friends, but their words of encouragement don't help me. "You have to move on, Emily," they tell me. But none of them really understand what it means to lose someone like Raul. It's not just about having lost my partner, but about having lost my best version, the one he brought out in me. One day, in a desperate attempt to find some peace, I decided to write him a letter. I spent hours choosing each word, making sure it didn't sound like an excuse or a desperate plea. I just wanted him to know how sorry I was, how much it hurt me to have betrayed him and destroyed what we had. I wrote to him about how every moment with him had been special, how I had always wanted to build a future by his side, but that my own insecurity and selfishness had led me to ruin it all. I asked for his forgiveness, not with the hope that he would accept me back, but because I needed to release the weight of my guilt. However, when I finished the letter, I didn't have the courage to send it. I kept it in a drawer along with all the memories I still have of him. A photo of us at the beach, a note he wrote me once telling me how much he loved me, and the ring he gave me on our first anniversary. That drawer has become my refuge and my punishment, a place I go to every time I want to feel close to him, even if only for a moment. Leo has tried to contact me, but I don't want anything to do with him. Sometimes I think about what it would be like if I could go back in time, if I could stop myself before crossing that line and value what I had with Raul. But the past is immutable, and now I'm trapped in a present full of remorse. Every night before I go to sleep, I repeat the same words in my mind. "I'm sorry, Raul." I know he will never hear these words, but I need to say them, even if only to myself. I'm sorry for not having been enough, for not having valued what we had, for having lost everything because of a selfish decision. Now I'm alone. My days are spent between regret and the hope that someday I can forgive myself, even if Raul doesn't. But I know his life goes on while mine has stopped at the moment I lost him. This is my reality. Living with the weight of my betrayal, with the emptiness of his absence, and with the knowledge that my own selfishness cost me the man I loved. Raul was my everything, and I was the cause of our ruin. And although I wish with all my heart that someday I can find happiness again, I know I will never stop regretting the day I stood him up for someone who wasn't worth it.